The Scottish Highlands awaken in absolute, freezing darkness. Deep within the Cairngorms National Park, massive shadows begin to stir. He is an undisputed apex predator of these grueling moors. A monarch burdened by a heavy crown and a relentless biological drive. The fierce autumn rut demands every ounce of his remaining strength. The relentless freezing rain offers no comfort to his battered body. Other creatures sensibly take shelter, bound by a different circadian rhythm. But he cannot afford to rest. He must keep moving forward. His magnificent 12-point antler rack is a heavy, dangerous weapon, designed exclusively for brutal combat and asserting total territorial dominance. Navigating the treacherous peat bog ecosystem requires immense physical stamina. Every single step drains his already depleted reserves of crucial energy. He drinks the murky water to quench a deep, burning thirst. But hypervigilance is essential, even for the king of the glen. His booming challenge rings out, warning any challengers in the vicinity. Leaving the bogs behind, the treacherous ascent into the crags begins. Even towering macrofauna watch quietly as the undisputed master passes by. He surveys the vast, unforgiving territory he bleeds daily to protect. The Scottish winds test the very limits of his sheer endurance. Exhaustion lingers deeply within the dark eyes of the scarred survivor. The dense tree line offers a brief, deceptive sanctuary from the storm. A Scottish wildcat watches silently, respecting the massive intruder's imposing strength. Scent tells him everything about the shifting biodiversity of this forest. Every sudden noise could signal a fiercely competitive rival approaching near. He marks the trees, a clear sign of his absolute authority. Daylight slowly reclaims the vast, heather-covered moors from the freezing night. The king emerges from the shadows to reclaim his open kingdom.
He vents his endless frustration on the resilient, unyielding Scottish heather.
Any rival foolish enough to challenge him will face absolute destruction. But such violent displays of power exact a terribly heavy toll. The morning demands a relentless, grueling march across the open plains. He pays no mind to the lesser scavengers trailing his path. Sustenance is scarce, but he eats quickly to maintain crucial energy. His focus remains entirely fixed on maintaining control of his harem. He pushes his battered body back into a painful, urgent trot. The shifting terrain here is incredibly unforgiving to exhausted, heavy legs. Gravity constantly fights against him, demanding an awful price for progress. He reaches the plateau, utterly breathless, battered by the Scottish Highlands. The brutal reality of the long survival journey finally sets in. Every breath burns like fire inside his vast, expanding, weary lungs. There is absolutely no shelter from the returning, merciless, freezing rain. He hunkers down, preserving core heat against the biting, bitter cold. But to stop completely is to invite a slow, freezing death. Summoning incredible willpower, the exhausted monarch forces himself back up again. The urge to dominate and survive outweighs the unbearable physical pain. The muddy banks of the distant loch present yet another challenge. Across the dark mirror of water, another territory fiercely calls out. Even exhausted, he must constantly remind the wild of his presence. He turns back inland, driven fiercely by deep, ancient, primal instincts. The very earth itself seems determined to drag the king downward. The dense, dying bracken slows his already exhausting morning progress considerably. Other local macrofauna easily step aside for the imposing, battle-scarred monarch. His magnificent 12-point antler rack constantly snags on the unforgiving landscape. A sudden, distinct scent dramatically shifts his entire physical demeanor. He instantly recognizes the undeniable chemical signature of a younger challenger. The peat bog ecosystem bears the violent scars of territorial dominance. An intruder has boldly crossed into his fiercely guarded highland territory. He analyzes the fresh urine and mud to gauge his enemy. The grim Flehman response draws the rival's scent deep into his senses. The testosterone-fueled autumn rut drives him into a state of sheer rage. As midday approaches, the initial adrenaline of the morning entirely fades. He is practically running on fumes, his immense energy reserves totally depleted. A profound, agonizing sleepiness threatens to overwhelm his powerful biological instincts. Without sufficient food, even the midday air chills him to the bone. Unable to march further, he surrenders briefly to gravity's merciless pull. The saturated, freezing peat offers a terrible, agonizing excuse for a bed. Even supporting the weight of his own crown becomes entirely impossible. For just a few dangerous moments, he completely drops his fierce guard. But true peace is entirely non-existent in the harsh Scottish wilderness. Painfully, the king forces his weary bones back into active duty. Parasites heavily infest his thick coat, demanding his immediate, frustrating attention. He aggressively grinds his antlers, removing dead velvet and itching parasites. Even this simple act demands massive amounts of his fading energy. He shakes the heavy mud away, readying himself for the afternoon. The dense thickets hold secrets that thrive quietly in the bleak shadows. Scavengers quietly trail him, waiting for exhaustion to finally defeat him completely. He isolates a sound that absolutely does not belong to the wind. Even an apex predator must constantly respect the dangers of the shadows. He reaches the glen, ready to assert absolute territorial dominance once more. He must desperately ensure his harem remains entirely, completely intact and protected. The ferocious sound travels for miles, a dire warning to all challengers. A distant answering roar confirms that a brutal challenge is now inevitable. His internal temperature skyrockets as absolute pure adrenaline floods his exhausted system. To survive the coming battle, he must urgently find any calories available. The sparse, bitter lichen offers incredibly poor, almost entirely worthless basic sustenance. He aggressively grinds the awful vegetation, swallowing his absolute burning pride entirely. It is barely enough to keep his heavy, battered, massive heart beating. This brutal, exhausting ritual defines the very core of absolute wild survival. As the afternoon slowly progresses, the freezing air temperature drops dangerously fast. He senses the impending twilight, knowing his ultimate crucial confrontation is extremely near. He leans into the ferocious wind, fueled entirely by pure ancient instinct. Far below, the violent sounds of rival stags clashing heavily echo upward. He breaks into a sudden run, entirely abandoning any sense of caution. The Scottish skies darken aggressively as a fierce Highland storm approaches fast. He stands completely defiant, a living monument perfectly suited to the coming violence. The storm finally breaks, unleashing its total freezing fury upon the Highlands. The elements batter him ferociously, but his unyielding forward momentum absolutely continues. His weapon is now washed entirely clean, prepared perfectly for impending war. The Scottish Highlands completely transform into a deeply flooded, treacherous wetland. He pushes entirely through the rising waters with unbreakable, stoic determination. The additional water weight severely burdens his already profoundly exhausted muscles. He completely embodies the resilient, unyielding spirit of the Scottish wilderness. Beneath the freezing rain, his incredibly thick coat preserves vital core heat.
The storm entirely breaks, revealing the very edge of his sacred harem.
He aggressively establishes a defensive perimeter around the females he protects. The king loudly announces his return, signaling absolute territorial dominance over them. But another stag's roar suddenly answers back from the opposite ridge. Visual contact is finally entirely established. The tense waiting is over. The younger, stronger usurper stands boldly across the vast, wet glen. He possesses the sheer raw energy that our older monarch completely lacks. Experience must now completely substitute for his severely depleted energy reserves. The highly ritualized parallel walk begins, heavily calculating the enemy's size. He violently tears the earth, attempting to entirely intimidate the young challenger. The psychological warfare escalates fiercely as the fatal distance rapidly closes. Neither highly aggressive male is willing to back down even an inch. The king firmly plants his heavy hooves into the soft peat bog. This is entirely the culminating moment of the entire grueling day. A deeply violent clash of titans is now entirely unavoidable. The Scottish sun finally begins its spectacular descent, casting blood-orange shadows. The entire local ecosystem holds its breath, anticipating the immense violence. He calls upon the very last remaining fragments of his physical endurance. The highly anticipated, brutally violent clash of heavy bone finally commences entirely. Absolute pure adrenaline totally eclipses the immense agony of his deep exhaustion. The kinetic impact equals a highly dangerous, extremely brutal car crash. Every single ounce of their massive weight is thrown entirely into combat. He utilizes his vast experience, expertly twisting the heavy, lethal rack. But the overwhelming youthful strength of the challenger forces him painfully backwards. The peat bog ecosystem transforms entirely into a brutally destructive gladiator arena. Exhaustion heavily suffocates both warriors, turning the battle into pure, brutal endurance. A single catastrophic slip in the deep mud heavily invites total destruction. But the reigning king absolutely refuses to yield his crown so easily. He digs incredibly deep, pulling purely from decades of hard survival instinct. The older monarch finally leverages his superior weight and absolutely massive experience. The youthful usurper suddenly begins to rapidly lose his crucial territorial footing. He capitalizes fiercely on the mistake, driving his full immense weight forward. The sheer agonizing pressure finally totally shatters the younger challenger's brazen confidence. He channels every ounce of his fierce biodiversity into one definitive strike. He severely underestimated the true immense power of the heavily scarred king. The older monarch violently reasserts the absolute borders of his Highland territory. A deeply haunting victor's roar officially concludes the terribly violent afternoon clash. The immense physical toll of his fierce territorial dominance is entirely absolute. Twilight finally settles over the beautiful, deeply treacherous Scottish heather-covered moors entirely. He remains the entirely undisputed, brutally tested master of his sacred harem. With the violent threat completely gone, basic survival foraging can peacefully resume. Another grueling day perfectly concludes in the utterly relentless, harsh autumn rut. Tomorrow at dawn, this brutal, ancient circadian rhythm will absolutely begin again.